Hey guys, tonight we walk into a waiting room that's just a little too warm. There's a half-dead plant in the corner, a stack of wrinkled magazines that haven't changed since Obama's first term, and a tension in the air thicker than hand sanitizer. A baby is wailing in the far left chair, her mom bouncing her anxiously. A man in business casual keeps clearing his throat and glancing at the door like it owes him money. And there's you, sitting stiffly between a poster of flu shot season and a sign that reads, in friendly all caps, immunizations required for enrollment. You're not sick, not yet, but the air smells like Lysol and faint dread. The lady at the counter just asked for your vaccination history, and your brain froze. Not because you don't have one, because this feels loaded. Welcome to modern public health, where a single form with a yes/no box might be more divisive than a presidential ballot. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're still in the waiting room when you start thinking back, because this didn't always feel like war. There was a time when vaccines were just boring little stabs in the arm, maybe followed by a lollipop or a sticker. Now it feels like choosing sides in a war you didn't enlist for. The front lines are school forms, work mandates, travel documents. Your enemy? Sometimes it's a virus. Sometimes it's your neighbor. A child nearby sneezes violently, and the dad beside her glares like it's a felony. You shift in your seat, wondering if anyone can tell whether you're up to date on your shots. You probably won't survive this socially, at least, if someone decides you're one of those people. And here's the thing no one says out loud. Everyone in this room thinks they're the reasonable one. The vaccinated mom thinks the unvaccinated dad is selfish. The skeptical couple thinks the CDC poster is propaganda. And you're trying to remember if you got that second MMR booster in college, or if that was the year you got mono instead. Time ticks slow here, so you scroll. And what do you see? A clip of a protest outside a state capitol. Signs reading "My body, my choice" right next to "Vaccines save lives." Somehow, both sides are shouting freedom. And somehow, they're not talking to each other, just past each other. Your phone vibrates. Group chat. Hey, is the school really requiring boosters now? A friend texts. I'm not doing it. This is ridiculous. Someone replies with a shrug emoji and a link to an article that looks, well, questionable. You open it anyway, because who even knows anymore? This is where the lines blur. You believe in medicine. You believe in choice. You believe in protecting kids. You also believe in asking questions. But lately, asking questions feels like picking a side. And that side could cost you friends, jobs, or even your seat in this very clinic. That's the quiet tragedy of vaccine discourse in 2025. It's not really about needles anymore. It's about trust. Who you trust. What sources you trust. Whether you trust the government, the pharma companies, your pastor, your cousin on Facebook, or that one nurse on TikTok who always sounds calm but also low-key terrifying. You glance up. The nurse calls another name. Someone walks past, clutching a yellow card and looking relieved. You wonder what decision they made. You wonder if it was even theirs to make. Historically speaking, yes, here comes your first fun fact. Waiting rooms have always been microcosms of fear and hope. In 18th century London, people would gather outside pox houses, where physicians experimented with variolation, literally rubbing dried smallpox scabs into open wounds to induce immunity. Charming, right? There were no clipboards, no pamphlets, just risk and prayers. Historians still argue whether Edward Jenner's famous cowpox experiments in 1796 were genius or guesswork. What we do know, he vaccinated an 8-year-old boy without informed consent and changed the course of medicine. You could say public health was born in a barn under questionable ethical lighting. Cut back to you in this modern, air-conditioned petri dish of opinions. You're not being experimented on, probably, but you are navigating a system built on centuries of hope, fear, miracles, and mistakes. The nurse smiles as she calls your name. It's your turn. You rise, your legs mildly numb from tension and poor circulation. The hallway smells faintly like disinfectant and cinnamon gum. She leads you toward a door marked consultation. Not exam room, not immunization, just consultation. Like they know this is going to be a conversation, not just a jab. Inside, there's a desk, a chair, and a stack of forms. One reads, "I consent to receive the following vaccines." Underneath are checkboxes: influenza, DAP, MMR, COVID-19, RSV, HPV, chickenpox. There's even one for shingles, just in case you feel prematurely elderly tonight. And here it comes, the pause. You don't grab the pen yet. You're waiting for something, for clarity, for reassurance, for a ghost of Edward Jenner to whisper, "It's okay. We've come a long way since cow scabs." But he doesn't. So you sit and you think, because this isn't just about immunity anymore. It's about identity. It's about the stories you've been told, the ones you believe, and the ones you're still trying to untangle. The pen is in your hand, but you don't move. Somewhere in the distance, a printer whirs, a kid coughs, and you're suddenly somewhere else entirely. Back in the archives of history, when the world's first vaccine was less a marvel of modern science and more a strange rumor passed through cattle fields. You picture a milkmaid in 18th century England. She's leaning against a fence post, cheeks flushed from the sun, and telling the village doctor, "I never get smallpox. I had cowpox once. It wasn't that bad." And instead of simply nodding and moving on like a sensible man, the doctor, Edward Jenner, goes, "Brilliant. Let's inject some of that into a child." That's not a metaphor. That's literally how it started. In 1796, Jenner scraped pus from a blister on a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and rubbed it into cuts on the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. Medical ethics wasn't so much a discipline back then as it was a polite suggestion. But when James didn't get smallpox after repeated exposure, Jenner declared victory, and the world followed. The word vaccine itself comes from vacca, the Latin word for cow. So yes, your annual flu shot has bovine roots. If you've ever questioned whether medicine had humble beginnings, remember, the thing keeping you alive today started with farmhand folklore and a gamble on cow pus. But it worked, eventually, and that's where the story gets complicated, because for every leap forward in vaccine science, there's been a stumble. Or 5. Take the Cutter incident of 1955. You're in post-war America. Polio is a nightmare stalking playgrounds. Jonas Salk is a national hero. And then one lab accidentally releases 200,000 doses of live polio virus instead of the inactivated kind. Dozens of children are paralyzed. Several die, and public trust takes a nosedive. Historians still argue whether the Cutter debacle should have halted vaccine programs entirely or simply prompted stricter regulation. What it did do was birth the modern FDA oversight structure and, interestingly, the very first murmurs of what would become the anti-vaccine movement. Not a fringe cult, just scared parents asking, "How did this happen?" And you get that, don't you? The fear, the mistrust, the feeling that maybe science moves faster than wisdom, that maybe the system wants your compliance more than your consent. Still, science didn't stop. Measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, hepatitis, HPV, the list grew. So did the schedule. In 1983, American children received 7 vaccines by age 5. Today, it's over 20. That's not conspiracy, that's CDC-recommended data. And while many of those shots protect against terrifying diseases, some parents still whisper, "Is this too much, too soon?" You're not an immunologist, but you have Google and late-night forums and family members who share articles with titles like "Big Pharma's Silent Coup" and "Doctors Admit to Lying About Vaccines and Natural Immunity." What they don't want you to know. You scroll past the Comic Sans headlines, but the seed is there now. Just a flicker of what if. You're not alone. In 2023, a Pew Research survey found that nearly 1 in 4 Americans expressed skepticism about routine childhood vaccines. Not just COVID routine. For some, the concern is the number of shots. For others, it's the ingredients: thimerosal, aluminum, formaldehyde, all used in tiny, safe amounts, but let's be honest, those names sound like they belong in horror films, not baby syringes. And then there's the speed. The COVID vaccine arrived faster than any major vaccine before it. It bypassed the usual years-long process and launched under emergency use authorization. For most scientists, this was a triumph. For skeptics, it was proof that corners were cut. You don't need to be a tinfoil hat wearer to feel nervous about something brand new being offered to billions of people. This is where the vaccine story splits into two competing narratives, each with its own heroes, villains, and plot twists. In one, vaccines are the pinnacle of human ingenuity, a shining beacon of progress that saved more lives than any other medical intervention. In the other, they're a tool of control, profit, and sometimes unintended harm. You've seen both versions play out online. One side posts graphs, the other posts personal stories. One side cites peer-reviewed studies. The other says, "My kid changed after that shot." And the terrifying truth is, both sides think they're saving lives. Now, here's the quirky bit you probably didn't expect. Anti-vaccine movements aren't new, and they're not always anti-science. In the 19th century, when Britain tried to mandate smallpox vaccination, entire towns revolted. In Leicester, protesters burned effigies of government officials and staged funeral marches for personal liberty. It was less about the shot and more about the state saying, "You have no choice." That tension between individual rights and collective safety is still pulsing under your skin as you sit in that consultation room. Even more curious, the vaccine wars didn't start with QAnon or cable news. They started with local newsletters, church bulletins, and word of mouth. A mom telling another mom what happened after the jab. An anecdote becoming a belief hardening into a movement. Back in the room, the nurse re-enters with a calm smile and a clipboard. "Ready to go over your options?" she asks. You nod, still unsure what those options even are. She speaks kindly, professionally, but every sentence lands like a chess move. "This is the updated schedule. This one's required for school. This one's recommended, but optional. This one, well, we strongly encourage it." You realize there's a language here. Required, recommended, optional, strongly encouraged. It's the dialect of modern compliance, where saying no is allowed, but frowned upon. You glance again at the forms. You think about cowpox and Cutter's legacy. About how we turned that incident into regulation, not retreat. About how we got from milkmaids to mRNA. And how, despite the centuries, the core conflict never changed. Do you trust the people holding the needle? You check the box, MMR, and leave a few others blank, more from indecision than defiance. The nurse nods, makes a note, and quietly steps out. You're left alone with your reflection in the laminated privacy poster. It warns of pertussis and how coughing can spread disease even before you feel sick. There's a child on the poster mid-sneeze. You wonder if that stock photo model ever got royalties. Your thoughts drift again, this time to a different kind of math, the math of infection. You remember hearing the phrase herd immunity back in high school biology. Back when herd sounded like cows and immunity sounded like magic. Now it's everywhere. Politicians say it. School boards argue about it. Social media shouts it in all caps. But what does it really mean? Here's the short version. When enough people are immune to a disease through vaccination or prior infection, it struggles to find new hosts. The spread slows. The vulnerable are shielded by the immune majority. It's community protection, a social safety net, immune style. But here's the kicker. It only works if a lot of people buy in. For measles, for example, scientists say the magic number is 95%. Below that, outbreaks can bloom like mold in a basement. Why so high? Because measles is outrageously contagious. A single infected kid in a room of unvaccinated classmates can infect 9 out of 10. That's not a fringe scenario, that's basic virology. Historians still argue whether the term herd immunity does more harm than good. Some say it sounds cold, dehumanizing, like people are livestock. Others say it's a necessary metaphor in a field where numbers mean life or death. Either way, the numbers don't care what you call them. You think back to the Samoa measles outbreak in 2019. Their vaccination rate plummeted to 31% after a tragic error involving improperly mixed vaccines. Parents panicked. Trust evaporated. Then came the virus. Over 5,700 infections, 83 deaths, mostly young children. The government declared a state of emergency. Red flags were hung outside houses to signal unvaccinated residents. A national campaign rolled through with nurses in vans and soldiers escorting doctors door to door. You stare at the boxes on your form again. There's no red flag on your house. No one's knocking at your door, but the pressure still hums beneath your skin. Because whether you realize it or not, every vaccination decision you make or dodge ripples outward. It doesn't just affect you. It affects the newborn next door, the cancer patient 2 seats over, the pregnant woman in line at the pharmacy. Of course, that logic goes both ways. Skeptics argue that if everyone else is vaccinated, then their unvaccinated kid poses no threat. Mathematically, that's kind of true until it isn't, because clusters form. Hesitancy spreads in circles, families, friend groups, zip codes. The map starts to show weak points, and that's how outbreaks happen even in countries with high overall coverage. You scroll on your phone out of habit. A blog post catches your eye. Why I Refuse to Be a Human Shield. The author, a mom from Oregon, argues that herd immunity is a moral guilt trip, that her kid shouldn't be used as a barrier for someone else's, that she's not responsible for strangers. You understand her frustration. You really do. There's something unsettling about being told your body is part of an invisible wall, especially when that wall comes with side effects, however rare, and a social stigma if you question it. And yet, if not you, then who? Public health doesn't have a plan B. Herd immunity isn't just a strategy. It's the only strategy for certain diseases that have no treatment. Measles, polio, whooping cough. Once the fire starts, you can't just douse it. You have to prevent the spark. But that's the tension, isn't it? Between individual risk and collective gain. Between your small, personal chance of harm and someone else's big, impersonal risk of death. So how do you calculate that? With charts? With empathy? With coercion? Quirky side note. During the 2009 swine flu outbreak, some British towns actually offered free concert tickets in exchange for getting the vaccine. Get jabbed. Hear jazz. It worked better than expected. Makes you wonder, should public health be more like marketing? You smirk at the idea. Free burrito with every booster. Honestly, not the worst campaign you've heard. But then again, is that consent? Or just clever coercion? At what point does persuasion become pressure? You remember a friend who didn't get the COVID booster because she felt manipulated. Not by science, but by social media. The constant drumbeat of shame. The TikToks mocking the unvaxxed. The people calling her selfish when all she wanted was time to think. You think about that. About how fear works on both ends of this debate. On one side, fear of disease. On the other, fear of being forced. That's the trouble with herd immunity. It asks for a kind of trust that's hard to measure. Trust in science. Trust in strangers. Trust that your small act matters in a big way. But that's also its beauty. When it works, it's not because of mandates or threats. It's because millions of people quietly chose to protect someone they'll never meet. You close your eyes for a second. Breathe in that sterile clinic air. It smells like alcohol wipes and something warm, maybe hope, maybe something else. You remember a line from an old medical textbook. The vaccinated protect the unvaccinated. The immune become guardians of the weak. That sounded noble once. It still does. But it also sounds exhausting. To be told your health is no longer just your own. The door creaks open. The nurse is back. She hands you a small card. All set, she says. We'll update your record. You thank her, smile politely, walk out. The waiting room's a little quieter now. The baby's asleep. The magazines are still tragic. You step into the parking lot, the sun low and drowsy behind a cloud. A breeze carries the faintest sound of birds and traffic, and your own thoughts still circling. You're not sure what herd you belong to, but at least now you know what they mean when they call it immunity. You're halfway to your car when the protest sign flashes back in your mind. My body, my choice. It's a phrase with a long, tangled history, borrowed, rebranded, and repurposed for everything from reproductive rights to mask mandates. It doesn't belong to anyone now, and yet everyone seems to claim it. Back in the 19th century, you'd probably be standing in a very different kind of protest. Picture Leicester, England, 1885. Thousands of people flood the streets in a massive march against compulsory smallpox vaccination. They're not anti-science, they're anti-mandate. Effigies of public health officials are burned in the town square. Coffins are carried, symbolizing liberty being buried. It's part carnival, part riot, all defiance. That's one of the great ironies of vaccine history. Mandates have always bred rebellion. Historians still argue whether these movements delayed public health progress or forced it to become more ethical and transparent. Maybe both. You fast forward a century. It's 1976. A U.S. Army recruit dies of a novel flu virus, H1N1. The government panics, fearing another 1918-style pandemic. A mass immunization program rolls out, but the virus never spreads widely, and reports of Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune nerve disorder, emerge among some vaccine recipients. The backlash is swift. Trust in public health takes another hit. The lesson? Even with good intentions, rushing policy can backfire spectacularly. Then comes the big one, COVID-19. Lockdowns, mask mandates, emergency authorizations. You remember the panic. The debates on Facebook that turned polite coworkers into amateur virologists overnight. Some people fought for mandates like they were life rafts. Others resisted them like they were handcuffs. And in the middle, always in the middle, are people like you. Tired, unsure, not looking for a fight, just some clarity in a sea of contradiction. You're not a stranger to mandates. You grew up with seatbelts, with speed limits, with school vaccines that no one really questioned at the time. Tap? Sure. Hip eh? Okay. But something about this era feels different. Sharper, more accusatory. Maybe it's because vaccine hesitancy used to be personal, and now it's political. Take the Tea Party movement in the US. A lot of early members weren't anti-vaccine per se, but they viewed any government-mandated health measure as federal overreach. Fast forward to COVID, and that same ethos found new fuel. Protests at state capitals, lawsuits against employers, nurses marching with placards that read, "Not anti-vax, just anti-force." You remember reading that during the height of the pandemic, some bars in Florida offered free beer to the vaccinated, while counties in Texas threatened fines for not masking. The country felt like a giant psychological experiment with two control groups, each convinced the other was brainwashed. You laughed softly, gallows humor, a coping mechanism. You recall how some friends refused to attend family gatherings unless everyone was vaccinated. Others refused because vaccines were required. Weddings got awkward. Thanksgiving turned into open mic night for conspiracy theories. And suddenly, people who hadn't talked about science since high school chemistry were citing preprint studies and natural immunity like they had medical degrees. But resistance isn't always irrational. You think of Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were taken without consent in the 1950s and used in decades of research. Or the Tuskegee syphilis study, where black men were denied treatment so researchers could track the disease's natural progression. Those weren't accidents. They were deliberate violations of trust. For communities affected by that legacy, skepticism isn't paranoia. It's memory. And yet, the danger of complete distrust is clear too. In 2003, northern Nigeria suspended polio vaccination campaigns amid rumors that the vaccine caused infertility. Within a year, polio reemerged, and cases spread to multiple countries that had previously eradicated it. So here you are, caught in the tension between rebellion and responsibility. Fringe fact for you. In 2019, a New York mother tried to claim veganism as a religious exemption to avoid vaccinating her child. The court ruled against her, but the case became a minor legend in vaccine debate circles. It's not about belief, they said. It's about sincerity and risk. You wonder what sincerity looks like in a world where motives are constantly questioned. where every choice feels like a statement, even if you never intended it that way. And yet, you understand the rebels. You really do, because while science marches forward with lab coats and data, humanity drags its heels in the dust of experience. We don't weigh facts in a vacuum. We hold them next to our fears, our histories, our pride. The truth? You can believe in vaccines and still resent being told what to do. You can support public health and still flinch at surveillance. You can trust medicine and still feel nauseous at the idea of your child crying under a stranger's needle. None of that makes you ignorant. It makes you human. Back in your car now, you sit with the engine off. The form is folded in your bag. You stare out at the pale glow of the clinic's automatic doors. People shuffle in. People shuffle out. No one looks like they're winning. You think of that nurse earlier. Her neutral tone, her script, but also her eyes tired but kind. Like someone who's seen too many forms filled out by people pretending to be sure. And for the first time today, you let yourself admit it. You're not sure, and maybe that's okay. You drive home with the windows cracked just enough to let in a breeze, but not enough for that one piece of napkin trash on your passenger seat to escape. Flutters, flaps, and stays put, like your doubt. Quiet, constant, inconvenient. At a red light, you glance at your rearview mirror and see a kid in the back seat of the car behind you. He's playing with a sticker on his arm. One of those circle bandages with cartoon dinosaurs printed on it. His mom is laughing at something he said. You can't hear them, but the picture is clear. The shot is done and they're moving on. Why can't it be that simple? You make it home. Shoes off. Lights dim. Fridge hums. You collapse on the couch like a weighted blanket. And then, because you can't help it, you open your laptop and type in a search bar, MMR vaccine risks versus benefits. This is how it begins for most people. Not with a manifesto, not with a protest, but with a question. And what comes back is complicated. You read that 1 in 3,000 children might have a seizure after the MMR shot, usually from fever, usually harmless. You read about encephalitis, brain swelling, very rare, but terrifying. You read about kids with autoimmune reactions, kids with fevers that climb like scaffolding, kids who never seemed the same afterward. You read the numbers again. They're small, minuscule, less than 0.1%. But if that 1/10 is your kid, does the math still comfort you? You also read that the measles virus itself causes encephalitis in about 1 in 1,000 cases. That 1 in 5 unvaccinated kids who get measles ends up in the hospital. That some go blind. That 1 to 3 per thousand die. And that the risk from the vaccine is orders of magnitude smaller than the risk from the disease. You read that part twice. You want to believe it. You mostly do, but belief is fragile when your gut is loud. Historians still argue whether risk perception is more shaped by statistics or by story. Behavioral economists say we respond more to vivid anecdotes than abstract percentages. We fear the lightning strike, not the car crash. And when it comes to our children, fear gets louder than math. You think of a friend, let's call her Andrea, who swears her son changed after his vaccines. He was verbal, happy, engaged, she said. And then after his shots, he got silent, withdrawn. Something shifted. Doctors told her it was a coincidence, that autism signs often emerge at the same age vaccines are given, that no causal link exists, that the study that sparked that fear was retracted, debunked, disgraced. But still, Andrea cries when she talks about it. Not because she's clinging to a conspiracy, because she feels abandoned by a system that can't explain what happened. You pause, because now the question isn't just what's true, but who gets to say what's true? You find yourself on a Reddit thread 137 comments deep, in a tangle of vaccine debates, anecdotes, links, rebuttals, and the occasional off-topic argument about raw milk. You don't know who to trust. The scientists seem confident. The skeptics seem sincere. The trolls are just hungry. Then you come across a post that sticks with you. It's from a nurse in Idaho. She writes, "I've seen one kid react badly to a vaccine. I've seen dozens die of flu, of RSV, of pertussis. You don't forget what it's like to bag a toddler. I'd take the risk of a sore arm, a fever, even a seizure over planning a funeral. It's not poetic, but it's real. And in that moment, you remember something odd, a detail you read years ago, probably in a trivia book. In ancient China, during the 10th century, physicians sometimes ground up smallpox scabs into powder and blew them into children's noses to protect them. It was called variolation. It sometimes worked, it sometimes killed them, but parents still lined up, hoping for protection. That's how old this dilemma is. 1,000 years, and we're still trying to balance the scale of risk. You close the laptop. You think of how strange it is that vaccine injury compensation programs even exist, because by their very existence, they admit the risk. The U.S. Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, VICP, has paid out over $5 billion since 1988. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's federal record. But it's also not the whole story. Those payouts cover a tiny fraction of doses given, and most are for non-life-threatening events. Still, $5 billion. That's a lot of pain being monetized. You stretch out on the couch, body curled like a comma, brain still writing its own paragraphs. You're caught in a strange emotional place. You're not anti. You're not blind allegiance either. You're someone who sees both the hero and the hazard in the same vial. You think of the phrase you heard once in a documentary, vaccines are a paradox of scale. What's tiny risk at the individual level becomes profound benefit at the population level, and vice versa. But humans aren't built for population math. We're built for faces, for names, for stories. You get up, pour a glass of water. Tastes like chlorine and clarity. Maybe what we need isn't more data, but more humility. Because both sides have their martyrs, their children, their stories etched into memory and grief. And if we could hold both truths without shouting down either, maybe this wouldn't feel like a war. Maybe it would feel like what it actually is, a messy, human effort to protect what we love, while fearing what we don't understand. You sit on your porch as the sky dims into a velvety blue, and somewhere between your fingertips and the railing, the conversation turns inward. You're thinking about that one word that keeps surfacing no matter where this vaccine debate drifts. Belief. Not just scientific belief, but spiritual, moral, deep-rooted and almost sacred. You've always known that faith and medicine walk a delicate line. But when it comes to vaccines, that line gets tightrope daily. And below it, a canyon of conflicting values. Let's start with something easy to overlook. Not everyone resists vaccines because of science. For some, it's theology, it's tradition. It's something whispered in houses of worship and passed down with bedtime prayers. You think of the Catholic family in your neighborhood. The dad, soft-spoken and kind, once mentioned over coffee that some vaccines were ethically complicated. You'd nodded vaguely, not sure what he meant. Now you know. Some vaccines, like older formulations for rubella or chickenpox, were originally developed using cell lines derived from fetal tissue, specifically from abortions performed in the 1960s. These cell lines have been replicated over generations and are no longer tied to fresh tissue, but their origin still troubles people, especially those whose faith teaches that life begins at conception. The Vatican itself has weighed in. It says such vaccines can be morally permissible if no alternatives exist, but also urges the development of new, ethically sourced options. A classic Catholic, yes, but please hurry with a better answer kind of response. Historians still argue whether these fetal cell lines, known as WI38 and MRC5, should be replaced entirely or preserved as relics of scientific necessity, and whether their legacy is one of progress or ethical compromise. Then there's dietary law. You once shared a lunch table with an Orthodox Jewish friend who explained why he always read medicine labels. Some vaccines use gelatin derived from pork as a stabilizer. That alone makes them a non-starter for certain observant Jewish and Muslim families. Even if a rabbi or imam says it's acceptable in this context, not everyone's conscience agrees. Quirky fact: the WHO and religious scholars once convened a global summit just to address this gelatin issue. That's how far-reaching the overlap between faith and immunization really is. And then you remember the Amish communities. In places like Ohio and Pennsylvania, outbreaks of measles and whooping cough have surged through clusters of unvaccinated residents. It's not because they're uninformed, it's because they view modern medicine, especially preventative medicine, as incompatible with their theology of simplicity and divine providence. These aren't people glued to conspiracy TikTok. They're not stockpiling horse paste or arguing on Twitter. They're quietly holding to a different framework. One where health is in God's hands, not Pfizer's. And yet, when these outbreaks happen, public health officials roll in with clipboards and urgency, trying to contain something that's already rooted in a very different worldview. You ask yourself, where's the line between respecting belief and ensuring safety? Legally, the U.S. allows religious exemptions for school vaccines in most states, though the list keeps shrinking. Politicians debate whether beliefs can be verified, whether they must be tied to a formal religion, and whether a vague spiritual objection counts. It's messy, subjective, and often emotional. You remember reading about a woman who tried to claim veganism as a religious exemption because the vaccine used animal products. Her case didn't succeed, but it exposed the fuzziness in defining belief. Is religion only valid if it's old? If it's organized? If it's uncomfortable? These questions haunt courtrooms. They also haunt dinner tables. You think about how awkward it gets when someone says, "I'm not vaccinating for religious reasons," and the room just nods, unsure whether to challenge or change the subject. Because how do you argue with faith? And yet, public health doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives in shared air, shared schools, shared hospitals. So when one person's faith collides with another's vulnerability, say, a child with leukemia who can't be vaccinated, whose belief wins? You're back in that consultation room in your mind, now looking at it through this new lens. You remember how calm the nurse was, how gently she navigated your questions. But what if you'd said, "I decline on religious grounds"? Would her kindness have turned to protocol? Would she have smiled and nodded or called in a supervisor? You wonder how many medical professionals have to carry this tension, balancing science with sacred boundaries. Some do it with grace. Some, frankly, don't. A friend once told you about a pediatrician who dropped their family as patients after they refused the rotavirus vaccine. "We don't treat non-compliant families," he said, handing over a folder of transfer paperwork. The mom cried in the parking lot, holding a confused toddler who just wanted a sticker. To her, it felt like exile. To the doctor, it felt like responsibility. And somewhere in the middle again sits you, listening, watching, weighing. You close your eyes and imagine a health system that listens before labeling, that asks why, instead of just when. You picture a rabbi explaining gelatin to a congregation, a Muslim nurse researching mRNA options for her clinic, a Christian scientist working on fetal-free vaccine alternatives, a parent trembling in a pharmacy aisle, whispering a prayer. You picture a society that holds space for nuance, and you wonder if maybe, just maybe, science isn't diminished by honoring belief. Maybe it's refined, because real trust isn't built on coercion or compliance. It's built on empathy, on context, on giving someone a reason to say yes that isn't just because we said so. You sip your water again, this time not for clarity but for grounding. Because this isn't about changing anyone's faith, it's about making room for all of ours. You wake the next morning still carrying the weight of questions that didn't get answered, only reframed. The sun's peeking through the blinds, too optimistic for how you feel. You shuffle to the kitchen, make coffee, and scroll absently through your phone. The headlines, as always, clash with themselves. Federal judge upholds vaccine mandate for healthcare workers. State rolls back school immunization requirements. Lawsuit filed over religious exemption denial. It's like the country is playing tug-of-war with its own immune system. So today you decide to look at the rules, not just the science, not just the stories. The laws, the structures that hold or sometimes strangle public health. Your first stop, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 1905. A case so old it predates the first Model T, but somehow still the backbone of modern vaccine mandates. Henning Jacobson, a Swedish immigrant and pastor, refused to pay a $5 fine for not getting a smallpox vaccine. He claimed it violated his liberty. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the justices ruled that individual rights can be limited for the greater good, especially in times of public health crisis. And just like that, the legal scaffolding for all future vaccine mandates was built. Historians still argue whether Jacobson should remain the gold standard. After all, the same era saw courts approving forced sterilizations. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, said Justice Holmes in 1927. In a ruling the court now regrets deeply, but Jacobson has stuck. It was reaffirmed in Zucht versus King in 1922, when the court ruled that schools could exclude unvaccinated students. It reemerged during COVID, cited in defense of state mandates. It hangs over every conversation about bodily autonomy like an old, dusty portrait in a courtroom hallway. And yet, Jacobson doesn't say the government must mandate vaccines, only that it can. Big difference. Fast forward to 2021. President Biden announces a sweeping mandate requiring large employers to ensure workers are vaccinated or tested weekly. Lawsuits erupt. Critics argue it exceeds federal authority. In January 2022, the Supreme Court strikes it down, saying the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, overstepped. But it does uphold a narrower mandate for healthcare workers. This legal whiplash leaves the public reeling. One minute, mandates are constitutional. The next, they're overreach. You start to feel like the Constitution is being rewritten every time someone sneezes. You think about the patchwork of laws across the U.S. In some states, vaccine mandates are strict. No school without shots, no exceptions beyond medical. In others, religious or even personal belief exemptions are enough to check the "I'd rather not" box. You pull up a map. Mississippi, of all places, has some of the toughest vaccine laws, only medical exemptions allowed. California, after a few measles outbreaks, tightened its rules too. Meanwhile, states like Idaho or Texas allow broad exemptions. It's like trying to manage a virus with a quilt. And when people cross state lines, so do their germs. Here's a fringe detail that still makes you pause. During a 2014 measles outbreak at Disneyland, some children were infected by unvaccinated tourists from countries where mandates were either too loose or too rigid, forcing underground refusals. A few of the kids too young to be vaccinated were hospitalized. The incident sparked national debate, but the virus didn't care about borders or policy nuances. That's what makes mandates such a legal and ethical minefield. They involve not just what's right, but who decides. Is it the federal government? State legislatures? School boards? Employers? Airlines? Do you remember during the pandemic when restaurants in New York City asked for proof of vaccination, but bars 3 blocks away didn't? How one hospital could require boosters, and another only asked for masks. You'd laugh if it wasn't so real. And then there's the slippery slope argument, the fear that if the government can require a vaccine, it could also require something worse. People bring up China's social credit system, digital tracking, biometric passports, Black Mirror stuff. A few steps too far, and suddenly the term public health starts to sound like state surveillance. It's not crazy to fear that. Abuse of authority is as old as authority itself. But you also can't ignore what happens without some degree of coordination. Look at the Clark County, Washington measles outbreak in 2019. One of the most vaccine-hesitant counties in the U.S. Perfect storm. The disease spread fast, fueled by religious and philosophical exemptions. The cost? An estimated $3.4 million to contain. That's $47,000 per case. And what about schools? You think of the emails from your local district. Updated immunization records due by August 15th. You picture the parents frantically scheduling doctor appointments, asking Facebook groups for pediatrician recommendations, whispering, "Should I just say it's religious?" Because here's the strange twist. While vaccine mandates often get painted as coercion, exemptions, especially poorly regulated ones, can be just as manipulative. Families game the system. Doctors face pressure to sign waivers. And suddenly, the law becomes less about protecting kids and more about protecting paper trails. You imagine a better way. One where exemptions are respected but reviewed. One where consent is meaningful but not weaponized. One where public health law isn't a sledgehammer or a feather, but something in between, a scalpel maybe, precision, nuance. You finish your coffee. It's gone lukewarm like your optimism, but you're not cynical. Not yet. You're just wondering what a law looks like when it protects both the vulnerable and the skeptical. When it upholds both public safety and private dignity. When it says, we trust you, but we also trust science. That shouldn't be too much to ask. You're driving again, this time not to a clinic, but toward the mall. Someplace neutral, crowded, normal. You park near a grocery store entrance where a teenager in a red vest is wrangling carts with the energy of someone deeply underpaid. You watch for a moment, then step inside. It smells like citrus disinfectant and bakery steam. The vaccine debate feels far away here until you pass the pharmacy. There's a folding table with a sign, walk-ins welcome, COVID, flu, RSV. A bored-looking technician scrolls her phone next to a neatly stacked pile of consent forms. No lines today, no drama, just another day in a country that vaccinates quietly and fights loudly. You think about the money behind that table, the frozen grin of corporate health. Because for all the talk about public safety and informed choice, there's a third player in this story that rarely gets invited on camera. The pharmaceutical industry. You already know the big names. Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, GlaxoSmithKline, companies with building-sized logos and marketing budgets larger than the GDP of some countries. During COVID, they became household names, championed, vilified, and memified, heroes and villains in equal measure. Let's start with polio, the disease that terrified a generation. In the 1950s, polio paralyzed tens of thousands of children each year. Parents were so scared they kept kids out of swimming pools during summer months. Then came Jonas Salk, who developed the first successful vaccine. When asked who owned the patent, he famously replied, "There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? It was noble. It was beautiful. It was not how things work anymore." Today, vaccine development is a multi-billion-dollar endeavor. Patents are currency, and Salk's son? Monetized. Pharmaceutical companies invest staggering amounts into research and trials, but also rake in record profits when the market's ripe. In 2022, Pfizer alone made over $100 billion in revenue, with $37 billion from COVID-19 vaccines. That's more than the entire annual budget of the World Health Organization. Historians still argue whether profit motives helped accelerate COVID solutions or distorted them. Was Operation Warp Speed a moonshot of modern medicine or a gold rush in scrubs? Maybe it was both. You push your cart past the vitamin aisle, where immune support gummies with smiling cartoon bears promise miracles for $18.99. Capitalism never misses a branding opportunity. But here's the part that makes your stomach twist a bit. In the US, vaccine manufacturers are shielded from direct lawsuits. Instead, there's a federal system, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, VICP, that handles claims. It was created in the 1980s after a wave of lawsuits nearly drove vaccine makers out of business. The goal was to protect supply. The result? A strange legal arrangement where you can't sue the people making the shots, but you can ask the government to pay you if something goes wrong. So far, the VICP has awarded over $5 billion. Most of those payouts involved minor or moderate reactions, not mass cover-ups or shadow conspiracies. Still, it reinforces a sense that the companies are playing with a different rulebook. You recall how during COVID, pharmaceutical CEOs testified before Congress about pricing, access, and booster approvals. You remember the scramble for early doses, the bidding wars between countries, the allegations of hoarding, and the opaque contracts with national governments that redacted entire pages. It didn't feel like medicine. It felt like business. You turn the corner into the baby supplies section. Diapers, bottles, thermometers, and a wall of baby pain relievers. Next to infant Tylenol, you spot a tiny syringe marked infant acetaminophen for post-vaccine fever relief. Even here, it's all connected. You stop and think, is it fair to expect moral purity from an industry built on profit? Should life-saving drugs be immune from market logic? Or is that naive in a world where everything, including your most personal health decisions, passes through a checkout lane? You remember reading that in many countries, vaccines are developed or distributed through state-funded systems. In Cuba, for instance, vaccines are produced domestically by government-run institutes. In India, the Serum Institute, privately owned but heavily subsidized, provides doses at a fraction of the US cost. In France, vaccine injuries are compensated through national health insurance. No legal labyrinth needed. So maybe it's not just the vaccines people are skeptical of, it's the ecosystem around them. The cocktail of capitalism, policy, and public relations that shapes how the message is delivered. You glance again at that folding table near the pharmacy.
Walk-ins welcome.
No mention of side effects, no literature on rare risks, no invitation to ask hard questions, just a clipboard and a box of pens wrapped in plastic. You walk past it, not because you're avoiding it, but because you've already seen the script. And now you want to see the footnotes. Fringe tidbit. In the early 1900s, pharmaceutical ads sometimes included actual poetry to build trust. One advertisement for a smallpox remedy ended with the line, "To jab is human, to protect, divine." You don't know whether to laugh or sigh. You check out with your groceries. The cashier doesn't mention the vaccine table, even though her name tag reads, "Ask me about flu shots." You don't ask. She doesn't push. The dance continues. As you load your bags into the trunk, you realize the thing that makes people nervous isn't always the shot. It's the silence around it. The unspoken deals. The hidden profits. The sense that consent isn't real if you don't have all the cards on the table. And maybe, just maybe, that's where trust has to start. Not with another advertisement. Not with another mandate. But with a real conversation. The mall fades in your rearview mirror, and with it, the feeling of fluorescent limbo. As the road opens into something quieter, less processed, you find yourself returning to the one event that changed everything. At least in living memory. COVID-19. You remember the beginning, the headlines from Wuhan, the eerie footage of deserted cities, cruise ships stranded like floating petri dishes, and then the wave, hospitals overrun, shelves emptied, everyone hoarding toilet paper like it was currency in a new dystopia. You can still smell the bleach in your grocery cart. At first, everyone seemed on the same team. Elbow bumps, homemade masks, people applauding healthcare workers from balconies. It felt almost unifying. But unity, it turns out, has a short half-life in an election year. Soon came the fissures, the pandemic videos, the shouting matches on airplanes, the cousin who suddenly cited virus like gospel but hadn't read a scientific article since high school biology. You remember someone saying, "It's not about the virus anymore, it's about who you trust." And there it was again, trust. You think about those first vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, emergency use authorizations, vials arriving under police escort, dry ice, elation, tears, selfies with band-aids, and then hesitation. First, it was about speed. How could they make this in under a year? People asked. The answer? Years of mRNA research that just happened to be ready. But nuance doesn't trend on social media. Then came the mandates. Employers, airlines, governments, schools. You had to show a card for everything. Concerts, weddings, restaurants. Some people felt protected. Others felt policed. Historians still argue whether the mandates saved lives or fractured trust beyond repair. What's clear is that they shifted the entire national conversation. From, "Is this safe?" to "Do I even have a choice?" You remember the woman on the local news who lost her nursing job because she wouldn't get the shot. She wasn't anti-vax, she said, just wanted more time, had questions. Now she was delivering groceries. You remember the vaccine lotteries, cash prizes, scholarships, free beer. A nation trying to bribe its way to herd immunity. You remember celebrities awkwardly urging the public to do the right thing, as if trust could be outsourced to Hollywood. You remember how it all started to feel less like health and more like theater. Even the language changed. Breakthrough infection, booster eligibility, fully vaccinated. The goalposts moved, the promises softened, and in the gaps, suspicion bloomed. You sit with that for a while, not in anger, just in quiet recognition. Because even if the science was solid, and largely it was, the rollout felt reactive, politicized, sometimes patronizing. First, masks were unnecessary, then essential. First, vaccines would stop transmission. Then they mostly prevented severe illness. The shifts were based on data, but to many, they felt like gaslighting. And people remember how they felt more than what they read. You think of your uncle, a retired teacher who got vaccinated the moment he could, swore by it. But when the third booster came around, he hesitated. Not because he doubted the science, but because he didn't trust the messengers anymore. You glance back at the road. There's a billboard overhead. Protect what matters, get boosted. It shows a grandmother hugging a toddler. You wonder how many people look at that and feel warmth, and how many roll their eyes, because somewhere along the way, this became about identity. Vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Compliant versus defiant. Pro-science versus conspiracy theorist. Nuance got drowned out by memes and mandates. You remember that chart someone shared? Over 50 doses of vaccine recommended for US children by age 18. It wasn't fake. It was just staggering. And without context, it made people nervous. No one explained why that number grew, or why the schedule differs between countries, or how regulatory agencies determine risk-to-benefit ratios. They just said, trust us. And when trust us is your only answer, you better have receipts. Fringe tidbit. During the height of the pandemic, a black market for fake vaccine cards emerged online. People were paying hundreds for a piece of paper that said they were safe. Not because they didn't believe in science, but because they didn't believe in systems. And you wonder, what kind of society builds rules so rigid that people would rather break them than follow them? You slow the car as a group of teenagers cross the street. They look like they were born in 2010, grew up wearing masks, got vaccinated before puberty, and probably see this whole debate as old people yelling at clouds. You smile. Maybe that's the hope, that they'll grow up with better questions, or at least fewer battles. You remember reading a line once, the problem isn't that people distrust science, it's that they distrust the systems wrapped around it. That hits different now, because most people, yourself included, don't want to dismantle medicine. They just want to be heard, respected, informed like adults, not nudged like cattle. You pull into your driveway, engine ticking softly as it cools. Your phone buzzes with a text. Booster clinic this weekend at the community center. You coming? You stare at it. Not because you don't know the answer, but because you're still living the question. You don't answer the text right away. Instead, you let the screen go dark and sit in the fading light of early evening. The porch creaks beneath you. Somewhere across the street, a sprinkler hisses into action. Too regular, too calm. A sharp contrast to the noise still rattling in your head. Because under all the headlines, under all the debates and statistics and screaming match comment sections, there's a quieter truth. The one you've been circling since this whole thing began. What does real consent look like? You think about the word itself. Consent. Should be easy. A yes, a no, a decision made without fear or force. But in public health, that simplicity dissolves fast. When a parent is told their child can't attend school unless they're vaccinated, was that consent? When an employee is told no jab, no job, was that consent? When a traveler is told they can't fly home to see their mother unless they get boosted, was that consent? You're not saying the rules were wrong. You're saying they weren't always human. Because real consent is more than a checkbox. It's trust earned through conversation, not compliance extracted through consequence. You imagine a different kind of system, one that opens with, here's what we know, here's what we don't, ask us anything. One where vaccine sites aren't manned by harried clerks and clipboards, but real people trained to listen, not just instruct. You picture a poster that reads, your questions are welcome here. Sounds corny, but also revolutionary. You think of a story you once read about a small-town clinic in Finland that managed to get nearly universal vaccination rates without mandates. Their secret? Long appointments. No rush. Just open, honest, patient conversations. People showed up nervous and left informed. Not just persuaded, respected. Historians still argue whether such models scale. But maybe the point isn't scale. Maybe the point is intimacy. The radical idea that people don't need to be bullied into care. They need to be brought into it. You take a deep breath. Let the air settle into your lungs like a slow truce. What if schools offered vaccine education nights, with speakers from both sides? What if exemption forms came with guided conversations, not just legal disclaimers? What if informed consent wasn't a legal term, but a cultural one? You're not naive. You know there will always be bad actors, conspiracy hucksters, political grifters, performative rebels. But most people, they're not trying to burn it all down. They just want to feel like participants, not pawns. And that's what the mandate era often got wrong. It assumed doubt meant defiance, that every question was a threat, that every delay was sabotage. But maybe people delay because they care, because they're scared, because their trust was broken long before COVID showed up. Maybe healing that breach means treating them not as obstacles, but as partners. You smile softly at the thought. It's probably not the kind of thing that gets funded, but it's the kind of thing that might work. Quirky aside, in 1980, Sweden held a national referendum on whether to make the whooping cough vaccine mandatory. They chose not to, but launched a public info campaign instead. Within 3 years, vaccination rates climbed again. Turns out, when you invite people into the process, they don't always say no. Sometimes they just say, "Thanks for asking." Your phone buzzes again. Another text. If you're not sure, come anyway. No pressure. Just info. You smile. Someone's trying. You tap back. See you there. Not because you've been converted, but because you're curious. Because you're no longer afraid of the question. And that, finally, feels like progress. The house is quiet now. The porch light clicks on automatically, casting a soft golden halo across the railing. You step inside, close the door gently behind you, and let your shoulders relax in a way they haven't all day. Everything hums just a little softer now. The fridge, the clock, the thoughts in your head. Even the questions that once felt sharp now drift like feathers, no longer begging for answers, just resting. You pour a glass of water, dim the lights, and sink into the couch. No more scrolling, no more charts, just stillness. And in that stillness, a new kind of clarity rises. You don't need to pick a side tonight. You don't have to win the argument. You don't have to prove anything. Not to your neighbors, not to the internet, not even to yourself. You're allowed to hold space for complexity, to want to protect others and still crave autonomy, to believe in medicine and still mourn its mistakes, to ask questions not because you're disloyal but because you care. That's what makes you human. So as your breath slows and your eyelids get heavier, let that be enough. Not certainty, not slogans, just the quiet confidence that you're allowed to think, to feel, to ask, and to grow. And that, in this complicated world, filled with shots and whispers, maybe trust isn't given or taken. Maybe it's built, brick by quiet brick, night by thoughtful night,